Let's talk about the United Nations. As you know, this time last night, in great chapter and verse I showed you, one of the great speeches that's going to annoy all the right people, that of course being the President of the United States. Packed house. They could not find, well, an escalator that worked or a teleprompter that worked, but also no room. When he was speaking, every single seat, it is filled to capacity. Pretty obvious when you were watching that speech yesterday. There you go, bang, room full to capacity. Well, Australia's turn today, and wasn't the Australian media excited that our Prime Minister was going to stand exactly where the President did? He would take his place as a world leader at the UN.
Donald Trump called it a con job, but tonight Anthony Albanese has taken to the same UN lectern to commend global efforts to slash carbon emissions.
Australia might not be a global heavyweight, but Anthony Albanese has told the world our country can play a bigger role.
The Prime Minister has revived Australia's bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council during his first Leaders' Address to the General Assembly.
I mean, this was a big deal, right? And in fairness, this happens every time an Australian leader stands up in front of the United Nations, which is, it's big for us, not really a big global event though. For example, let's have a look at some of the attendance. How packed was the House when our bloke was talking?
This week, Australia recognised the state of Palestine because, to quote from the Charter, that forms the very foundations of this institution and reflects the very best of its idealism. We are determined, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights.
Oh, hang on, you may notice there was no shots of the crowd. You see, that's what most people saw. That's what you saw on your 6 p.m. news. This is what happened from the very start of the speech, when you actually pull the shot back a little and look at the empty seats.
80 years ago, the people of our nations came together and put their trust in each other's humanity. An act of faith all the more extraordinary when we recall the devastation that still gripped the world.
It is a wonderful reminder to every Australian leader, and it happens to every Australian leader who is there. We're a big deal for us, right? And we're the best country in the world, no question. Love this joint, never have a go at it. But a little reminder that maybe we are not as big as sometimes we think and sometimes our own media make out. Another example?
And that is why Australia is seeking a place on the UN Security Council in 2029-30. And it is why we are bidding to co-host the 31st Conference of the Parties with our Pacific family.
Again, that's probably what you saw on the 6 p.m. news, which was, he could pull a crowd of his own ministers. Did you also notice that the communications minister was there? I thought that the Optus 000 thing was the single biggest story in the world. No. The minister who, of course, the Minister for Sport, the Minister for Free Stuff, as I've shown you before, was desperately needed in the US, despite the fact the 000 system was apparently the major issue. Whatever. Stop nitpicking, Paul. Is there any other examples of just how many people were not paying attention, apart from the people who were paid by us to be in the room?
This is a place for the global spotlight to shine on suffering and struggles that might otherwise be forgotten, and for the international community to work together to advance our shared interests.
Oh, that's cruel. Again, every Prime Minister, right? This is what happens to all of them. But because the Australian media is also excited, Australia discussing taking our place as a world leader, reality is echo. Like, it's like giving a speech of the Three Sisters or the 12 Apostles. Not a lot of people there. Perhaps my favourite of all of the cutaways today, just pay attention to how excited the Papua New Guinea delegation was. Now, for whatever reason, they were in the front row. And just last week, the Australian Prime Minister, on the behalf of the Australian taxpayer, promised $100 million to build a ministerial wing, to put an extension on the parliament. So this guy is bringing the cash, bringing the football team, hoping for closer defence ties, but hardly bringing, what's that word? Well, I prefer to just show you.
More than ever, we must work to see the promises of this place deliver real progress for the people that we serve.
Play it again. Just that one again. Again, I know, every Prime Minister, it's not a Liberal Labor thing, it's not an Albo Turnbull thing, right? How excited were they from Papua New Guinea? Again, we're building an extension to their parliament, helping pay for a football team. That's all part of the soft power. We want to kind of merge the defence teams.
More than ever, we must work to see the promises of this place deliver real progress for the people that we serve.
Oh, wow. Every now and then you need a reminder, don't you? Not as big as we think we are sometimes. The greatest country in the world, no question. But sometimes when we speak, the world is doing anything else. Now, as you know, an example of that would be that Australia and Australia's politics has demanded major action on climate change. Now, again, I'm not sitting here pretending can't see anything, can't hear anything, not aware of the world as it is. But as you know, I've always told you that Australia is 1% of the world's problem. Australia now has a bold new goal to deal with 1% of the world's climate problems, recently announced by the greatest Prime Minister of all time and the Chris Bowen.
Today I announced that we have accepted their advice that Australia's 2035 emissions target be 62 to 70%.
Of 1% of the world's problems. And a big way we're going to get there is from moving from a power grid that 100% has worked for decades to one that is going to work for decades. What's the percentage again, Blackout Boy?
Once we get to 82% renewable in 2030, which I, am working towards achieving and have some confidence we will achieve, then we'll keep going to ensure that we have a reliable grid and a cheaper grid.
And look, the reality is, even if we do all of that, even if we get to 100%, even if we got to 200%, and we were able to somehow fix not 1%, but maybe 2% of the world's climate problems, the reality is that it will not change the weather globally. Why? Because, as I've told you before, if you think of every single country in the world as a climate clock, as a clock starting at 12, ending at 12, well, 45 minutes of it, China, Third World, United States, India, Russia, not going to move the needle, right? We can do whatever we want, 62 or 70% of 1% of the world's problem, done with 82% of renewable energy. Heretic, misinformation, of course, they will say, to even mention this. Well, today, China made a very big announcement. Now, the president, well, other stuff to do. So he just did a little zoom in, perhaps saving the planet. Decided to zoom into one of the side chats happening at the UN. Now, remember, Australia, 70% of 1% of the world's problem. Renewables will be 82% to help us fix 70% of 1% of the world's problem. China, well, the best part of what? Almost 40% of the world's problem, depending on how you look at these things. Maybe a little closer to 30, but you get my point. So here was the big announcement. They've got a climate target, so what is it?
Let me take this opportunity to announce China's new NDCs as follows. China will, by 2035, reduce economy-wide net greenhouse gas emissions by 7% to 10% from peak levels, striving to do better. Increase the share of non-fossil fuels in total energy consumption to over 30%.
Wow. Let's compare the pair, right? Australia, 1% of the climate problem, 70% of emissions, 82% renewable energy. China, more than 30%, sorry, I didn't have my glasses on before, more than 30% of the world's problem, well, they are going to reduce by 7 to 10% of 31% of the world's problem, and they will get to 30% renewables. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Again, the whole argument here is that we're running out of time, global boiling, all the rest of it, right? The biggest polluter is not dealing in any urgency here. Oh, but Paul, 10% of their 30% is going to be more than 70% of our 1%. Oh, so now 1% matters. The whole point being, of course, that China doesn't just get to continue to pollute up the yin-yang. They also make things like the solar panels, the wind farms, some of which is made with slave labour, sold to countries like Australia for billions and billions of dollars to fix 1% of the world's problems. But we must change everything. We must change everything. And about that cost of transition, all right? Been sitting on this one for a couple of days, but it is worth talking about that, again, these targets, and again, the numbers start to all waddle around. China 31%, Australia 1% of the global problem, right? Between us 32% of the global problem. Australia's going to do something between 62 and 70% of 1% of the world's problem. China between, as you saw, 7 and 10% of 31% of the problem. So how are we actually going to do this? Well, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, Australia is going to need to quadruple the number of wind farms that we currently have. According to, again, that climate report, where you remember the responsible reporting of that was that Australia is going to have a Mad Max future where nobody's going to be able to live here. That independent advice has spelt out the mammoth task ahead of the government to get to 70% of 1% of the problem. Australia will need twice as many rooftop solar panels, 20 times more electric vehicles, and almost all of its power generated by renewables within a decade to reach the bottom end of Labor's 2035 target. And then there was this little one served up in the analysis section of the Channel 2 website. Farmland for forests may be the net zero trade-off. The most straightforward way to achieve the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that the CSIRO and therefore the government will be relying upon is to plant billions of trees on productive agricultural land around the east and west coasts of Australia. Well, hang on, sorry, I thought that was called, remember, direct action at one point, and that was absolutely a disgraceful policy, according to the left. This farmland is currently used to grow wheat, canola, grapes, or where cattle is pastured. No, bugger all of that. Replace it with forests and lock it up so nobody can get anywhere near it. This scenario, or that scenario, suggests that Australia's agricultural sector would shrink dramatically. The land would be needed for forests. Now, obviously, all of this would be great because we would be able to do our bit for 1% of the world's problem, where China is doing less for more of the world's problem. And all of this will, of course, cost us less money in the long run, right? Again, I've been sitting on this for a couple of days, but this was the Prime Minister in Canberra being confronted with the question that wasn't really being asked that seriously and batted it away because we don't want to get stuck in the $275 of it all because that's just inconvenient, isn't it?
Prime Minister, you say this will put downwards pressure on energy prices. By what exact figure?
You yourself laughed when you asked that question, so it should be treated in the spirit in which you've done. What we know is, if we don't act, there will be a cost to the economy, as the Treasurer has outlined.
How disgraceful is that? And the fact that the people who report on this giggled at the mere concept. That is there a number somewhere in all of the numbers, all of the studies, somewhere that can tell us how things get better for those of us that are having to pay? Gordon Samuel, a former boss of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, he also has written this week that the cost of transition should be bared by the emitters, not by the customers. But of course, the customer ends up having to pay, either as the taxpayer or as the customer of the big emitter. But it's just a joke. Now, to even ask whether there is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and to question the process means you're a climate change denier, and to question the goal means that somehow you want everyone to die. No. But that's the state of the game. That is where we are right now. So are you surprised that you probably didn't hear on the news tonight? You probably will not read in the newspapers tomorrow that while China goes, crumbs, we're doing what we're doing. Does this make sense? It is what Australians seemingly want. They re-elected this government. But have we really honestly changed that dramatically as a country in 3 or 5 years, where we're willing to do that to ourselves while the actual cause of the problem, the people who will have an effect on our weather, take the piss? Now, a couple of nights I've had something to say either sort of lightly or directly about Andrew Hastie. And a few people have sent me some pretty staunch, sharp emails, right, thinking somehow I've got it in for him, I don't like him, I don't back him, all of that stuff. Hey, let me be nice and clear. Andrew Hastie is a hero, okay? An absolute hero. He is better than 95% of the people who serve in Parliament because he served his country. And that makes him an instant winner in my book, and hopefully everyone's book, as somebody who should absolutely take a role in leadership of this country, right? When I say things about how he's going about that leadership, I want you to always know that's where it comes from, okay? Because I wanted to be very clear that I admire this bloke, okay? Now, we have had him on the show, but we're not particularly close. I look forward to getting to know him along with the rest of the country as we roll on. And I want him to be a successful voice. But as you know, the past couple of days, he's been pretty obviously trying to lift his profile a bit, seemingly picking a certain lane that he believes should be either the future of the Liberal Party or the future of the country. Good luck to him. Great, that's what we want. But then, of course, came the question that if he didn't answer it the right way, he'd go off to the back bench. Now, when he goes off to the back bench, that would be the beginning of a potential challenge to Susan Lee. So as long as he answers like this, no plan for a change.
I support Susan. Anyone who's speculating otherwise is being mischievous. My main concern is that the centre-right is fragmenting. We've seen the rise in the One Nation vote and other micro-parties. And having us fragmented on the right is very strategically advantageous for Labor. And so I'm simply saying what people out on the street are looking for in their political leadership. I'm simply, during this policy development phase, building principled positions where I think we should go.
Great, that's what we want, right? So he's doing it all, building his worldview out and letting people know. Great, awesome, no problems. His Instagram is also growing pretty fast. As best as I could check, I think he's clearly the one with the most follows in the opposition, certainly more than the leader, certainly more than some pretty significant figures that have been around for a while. And that's important. Why? Because as we know, after the last election, the reality is that you need to be in the fight, particularly on social media. And he's been pretty creative and there's been some pretty good people around him. Yes, there's going to be a but. Of the past couple of days, this is one of the videos that he put up, and I like this idea about putting sort of a whole series of values in quotes, and you've got to slide through them. That's why you might see those little arrows there, if you're unfamiliar with Instagram as a platform. But thousands of people have seen this and thousands of people like it. In the last 2 years, we've added nearly 1 million people to our population. Australians are feeling the impact of Labor's immigration policy. Agree. We are starting to feel like strangers in our own home. That's going to be a problem because it will be deliberately taken out of context and weaponised. We've seen some people do that today. I'll get back to why that's a problem in a second. Our infrastructure is under pressure. Essential services from schools and hospitals are stretched thin. Australians are locked out of the housing market. Many are house poor, spending most of their income on rent and mortgages. Again, great point, okay? But as you know, the Labor Party is so intent on any conversation about this issue in any way, shape or form, it immediately being twisted into either a dog whistle about race or just an outright foghorn trying to accuse anyone who talks about this of being a racist. Here was Tony Burke today.
Mr Hastie, one, needs to decide whether he's happy with modern Australia or not. Does he want to make additional cuts to skilled migration? And if that's what he wants to do, can he nominate which aged care centres he believes should close? Because without immigration, we don't keep them open. Can he nominate which childcare centres he wants to close? They're questions for him to answer. And the moment you get to detail, he seems to go missing.
I mean, again, Firstly, so cocky. Secondly, so disrespectful, all right? Again, Andrew Hastie, by defending this country, by being part of the SAS, is a greater citizen than the extreme, again, 95%. It's just the way it is. Inside our federal parliament and close to 100% of the people that are sitting around the cabinet table. It's just the way it is. Sorry, that's the way I like to value certain service, right? Lifetime in politics, nothing compared to actually putting your life in danger as he has, as Philip Thompson has, as other people have. But the free pass to this twisting is that bit that I mentioned before that I kind of have a problem with. Straight away, the ABC was able to, and again, every time, remember, elections are not just decided on the 30 days of an election campaign. They also try to build caricatures around people. Now, if he is the bloke who is the leader of the Liberal Party in 3 years' time, or he's still as the Shadow Defence Minister or Home Affairs Minister backing in Susan Lee, it's about trying to muddy this bloke up, okay? They did it when he came into the Parliament. I remember defending him on this network at the time. But again, we're starting to feel like strangers in our own home. That part of what he wrote is troublesome to me because that sentiment is one that I have heard many people say. I've had many discussions as I travel around the country in both city and in the bush, in suburbs that may well have started out in the 1950s as places where people after World War II made a community that now looks and is very different than what it was. I understand why some people say things like that. But I'll tell you why you shouldn't say stuff like that if the purpose is to try to eventually get 76 seats in the Parliament. Because Australia, whether you like it or not, is demographically very different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Meaning a whole bunch of people before today made a whole collection of decisions and we are where we are now, right? That's not me going a soft way of saying, yeah, you're right. It's just saying, if you want to win 76 seats, you need to win over, via direct or preferences, half of all of the people in all of those seats. And the Libs have lost an awful lot of seats, particularly in places like New South Wales. And because of population, you need to do well in New South Wales. Because of population, you need to do well in Victoria, okay? So the message matters in those places that have changed over the years. But this is also the really important point about why you can talk about immigration in terms of 1 million people, queues getting longer, because that's all absolutely real. But this is also real. The census tells us the reality of immigration in Australia, the reality of what our homes and our families look like. Now, this number comes from 4 years ago because we're due for a census next year. But more than a quarter of the people in this country, and presumably, therefore, the number of people who can vote, were born overseas. That number has been growing ever since 1947. Now, you can see relatively slow growth from, say, the 60s to the 80s to 2001. 2006 is when we start to see the spike, where we go from about 20% to now close to 30%. But hang on, Paul, 27%, that's not half, that's 51%. Well, what about this number? Nearly half of all of Australians have a parent who's born overseas. In fact, while 27.6% of people were born overseas, 48.2% of people in Australia, and thus people voting in elections, have a parent that was born overseas. So when you talk about immigration, you have to talk about immigration not in a way that can ever be misinterpreted by your political opponents as something that is about race and culture, because it can be so easily weaponised. Now, yes, correct. A huge portion of that 48, UK, New Zealand, Ireland, but all of that's changing. But when I say you need to, not just impress people in a certain lane, to win over a certain bubble, you need to reach out beyond it to convince people who have voted Liberal in the past to vote Liberal again. So therefore, the conversations cannot have this tinge in any way, shape or form, real or imagined, in and around race and culture. Let me show you. The seat of Bennelong held by John Howard for how long? Well, now, 53% of that electorate, people from overseas, born overseas. 74, 3/4 of the seat has a parent born overseas. That's why how you talk about migration matters, which in part would be why Bennelong, which should be notionally and all the rest of it, something the Libs can win, is slipping further and further away from them. Same as the seat of Reid. Remember, national average, 27% of people born overseas, 48% of people have a parent born overseas, 56-76. That, again, is a place the Liberal Party has had for a long, long time. It traded many, many elections. A couple in a row now it's starting to get away. Why? Because, in part, the conversation is being weaponised by Labor and the Greens and the media, that any conversation about migration has this tinge to it, which is why, in my view, you stick with the infrastructure conversation. What about the seat of Parramatta? This was one that Ross Cameron, our old mate, Ross Cameron was, of course, the member of way back when. It's been Labor. It will be Labor forever. What about the seat of Chisholm? Kind of back and forth now, starting to rip away. 71% of people have a parent born overseas. So when we talk about migration, there is a very good chance that a very significant number of people in a very significant number of seats that are needed to actually change the government may well listen to that in a way that can be weaponised. So again, Australia should be able to have a conversation about how many people we have in it and the stuff that we have here to be able to cope with the number of people that are in it, which is why you can talk about literally how many people are here and what the consequences of that are, about how hard it is sometimes to find a job or the right job or to get around a city, that when you call 000, there's not enough hospital beds, which means you sit in the back of an ambulance and then the 000 calls start banking up, or how long it takes to get to work. Now, again, yes, if you mention all three of those things, people like Tony Burke will turn around and say, dog whistle about race. So the best way to guarantee that they can't use this tactic against it is just to avoid that bit of the conversation. Not because you're trying to sneak it in, but because the reality is that Australia is what it is now. And if you, like me, think that Australia's in the wrong place because of our government, then you need to change the government. To change the government, you need to win more than half of the people in more than half of the seats. Otherwise, sure, we can all impress each other about how hard we're going to go, but the reality is it'll be more of the same. And collectively, as a country, it gets worse, not better.